Hello, so this is the second video dealing with the, for want of a better name, less developed countries. So I just finished talking about some of the supposed benefits like roads, etc., of imperialism, which again, I'm going to have a little bit of a question about. But we really shouldn't also forget the other effects of imperialism, right? The other effects of to these uh, countries that Britain and yeah, most of the examples I'm going to use are Britain did because really empire. I think empire was partly about states feeling powerful. I do think you do see some of that. I think that is definitely true that European countries wanted to feel important and having an empire as a way of feeling important. I think that's definitely true. But it was also economic. And it was, I would argue, mainly economic. And so, if you think about it, you know, Britain and France and Germany and Belgium stole. They stole resources. They stole, like, literally stole people, like, stole people, and sent them to work as slaves around the world, not just in America, not just in the Caribbean, but the East India Company had slaves working, shipped out to what is India, the East India part of East India. They stole goods. There's been this whole thing, about the diamond, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is in the British Crown. It's in the British Crown. It was stolen from India. I if you go to the British Museum, it's an example of stuff that the British have stolen from everywhere, stolen from India, stolen from China, like literally looted these places. So, there's that, but it's also about stolen land, right? I mean, when we talk about stolen land, it's literally stolen. Britain, when it took over Kenya and sent people to work there and settle there, the people who went generally to Kenya from Britain were pretty incompetent. They tended to have failed in England, so they had to leave England. They were kind of notorious for their social and sexual depravity in Kenya. There's lots of literature you can read about this. They also needed jobs, and they became farmers, and they were particularly bad farmers. I mean, many of the things we think about colonialism is developed these economies. British farmers went to Kenya and failed, absolutely failed, took the best land from Kenyans and absolutely failed. The British government, in fact, had to change the laws, so they could only buy food from white farmers in Kenya, and they still couldn't succeed. Because I mean, it's partly incomes, it's partly people who went, but also if I was a farmer in Britain and I suddenly went to Kenya, maybe I don't know how to grow stuff in Kenya. I'm used to being in a country where it rains all the time. Uh, Maybe that was not they were, you weren't going to be successful. But the chaos this caused for the Kenyan people, um, you know, in many like in the biggest ethnic group in Kenya, you couldn't marry until you had land, right? A man could not marry until he had land. Now, if all the land has been stolen by English people, how can you marry? Like literally, how can you marry? Because you must have land to marry. And so Kenyans could not marry. They could not succeed. Um, and it was also the trade when we talk about, trade was in aid of for a better want of term, the mother country. So, for example, Britain's trade with India or Britain's trade with any country in its empire was about what Britain needed. So, India is a great example, right? And I think I've spoken about this, but Indian cotton is a high class cotton. But the British, of course, and Indians had been making clothes for yeah, thousands of years. But no, then cotton had to be shipped to Manchester and then shipped back to India. So cities like Manchester became massively wealthy on Indian cotton. It's Manchester is referred to sometimes as the cotton capital, right? But you're not growing cotton in Manchester, but it's processed there because we took it from India. we processed it in Manchester and sold it back to Indians. I think I've mentioned about salt. Indians could not produce their own salt. They had to buy salt from England. This is, you know, this absolutely unbelievable exploitation of these countries in terms of their raw materials, in terms of how they were allowed to enter the market and who they could trade with, all of these things. That's what colonialism was. That's what imperialism was. It was a way of wealthy countries to become wealthy. And India, is a great example of that. A massively wealthy country. The British and French fight over it because it's so wealthy. And once the British get it, once the East India Company gets it, then India is massively pauperized by basically theft from them by the British. China, the same. And in fact, we even demanded that we were allowed to pay Chinese workers in opium. And we fought wars over that, right? So this idea of, economic development, be careful when we think about it. But there's the last thing I'm going to talk about before in this video is the one of the problems that happened really, which I think, O'Neill kind of skips over is that the problems caused by the independence movements in the less developed countries. And I don't mean the problems of the independence movements, right? I think I can, and I think as Americans, you should be able to understand, and I can understand as someone from an Irish background, I can understand the importance of independence movements. But we kind of, and particularly the British kind of portrayal, the end of independence movements, and I've heard people refer to these, British independent, like Britain dealing with independence movements as like a model, and I think it's definitely a model, but it's not the model in way people think about it. Is that, the end of the end of empire had a brutal effect on many of these countries. Like, so, I mean, and I think we'll talk at least one of the classes about Vietnamese independence. But I think Americans think of the Vietnam War from their own aspect of America being involved in the Vietnam War. But like really, when we think about Ho Chi Minh, we should think about the role he played in independence of Vietnam from France. France fought a brutal war to keep Vietnam or Indochina as part of the French Empire. Um, if I had time to have spent, if we'd had time to cover political violence, we would have spoken a lot about Algeria and the Algerian independence movement. And there's a movie, which again, I'm going to say you should watch, but there's a movie called The Battle of Algiers, which is one of the best movies made about an independence movement. But France did not give up Algeria easily. It went kicking and screaming. The French, uh, you know, they took, they sent troops in, they took part in paramilitary operations, they blew up Algerian houses, the houses of Algerians. They murdered many of the leaders of the Algerian independence movement, literally murdered them, not like executed them after a crime, literally went into a prison cell and shot the leader of the Algerian independence movement, Ben Medi, and then claimed that he hung himself. But it's quite clear that a French army officer shot him without trial. You can think about what happened in Belgium when the Belgians left Congo. There was an independence movement in Congo. The leader was elected democratically. The Belgium and involving many people think the CIA and elements of the people in the Congo killed Patrice Lumumba, who was the leader of the Congo independence movement and prime minister of Congo. Supposedly, he was thrown out of a plane by Belgian paratroopers. Right? I mean, if you think about it, imagine what America would have been like in terms of setting up an independent country if during the independence movement, the British had literally executed most of the leaders of the independence movement. If they'd executed Washington, if they'd executed Benjamin Franklin, if they'd executed the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, what problems that would cause because you've cut off the kind of you've kind of beheaded the independence movement and you've beheaded the movement, the people who will lead that country once um, once it becomes independent. There is a huge problem, I think, that we have to think about the effects of the independence movement kind of through the ages afterwards because of the chaos it caused in many of these countries. And I don't think we should ignore that. So probably the best example I can think of. So I grew up in Britain, as you'll know. And I grew up like hearing about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. And Mau Mau, British people portrayed Mau Mau, and it's kind of mentioned if you see any British cultural elements, any literature talk about Mau. Mau Mau is this brutal uprising of Kenyans, which was brutalized the settler population. It was, vicious, independence. Just simply not true. It's likely that during the Mau Mau uprising, fewer than 60 whites were killed by during the people who were part of Mau Mau. It's almost certain that the British killed over 50,000 Kenyans in retaliation. Britain set up concentration camps. This is after the Second World War. And concentration camps, by the way, I think most of us think of them as linked to the Nazis, but of course, the British were the people who developed the technology of concentration camps. We were the first people to use them in empire. Um, but during after Mau Mau, after Mau Mau, British set up concentration camps where they brutalized tens of thousands of Kenyans. It's fairly likely that President Obama's father, President Obama, a lot of British people kind of complain that President Obama doesn't seem particularly wasn't didn't never saw particularly pro-British. Uh, the British Prime Minister would give him a gift, and he would give. I think the British Prime Minister gave him this like uh, paperweight or something, which was made of wood of a slave boat, which there'd been a court case about, which, this kind of very, anti-slavery type of symbol. And I think he gave the British Prime Minister like the box set of Friends or something. And people are like, oh, how could? But President Obama was definitely not born in Kenya. Definitely not born in Kenya. Definitely born in Hawaii. But his father was Kenyan. And it's almost certain that his father was probably tortured by the British in a concentration camp. He was definitely rounded up as part of uh, the roundup after Mau Mau. And if he was in a concentration camp, it was almost certain that he was tortured, right? Because that's what the British did. So, I think these things, of course, can cause problems for when those countries become independent. If you have brutalized them, if you have like kind of played on the divide and rule tactic where you've split up groups and had them fight each other, well, once you leave them together, kind of entrenched these problems. And I think that's a fundamental problem that we'll talk about the more on Thursday when we talk about how the less developed countries have kind of moved through colonialism and how they've dealt with the problems of the post-imperialist world. But I just wanted these two videos to talk and very, very quickly, far quicker than I would like to talk about like kind of the problems as I see and the effects of colonialism and empire on what we can think of as the less developed world. But I really think that they're we should maybe use the term the victims of imperialism, the victim countries of imperialism, because I think that's really what we're talking about this week. So I'll finish the video now. See you all in class. See you soon. Bye bye.